Anderson, over 1 million people every year develop cancer. There are over 100 different types of cancer, but many people don't really know what is cancer. And the answer to that question is very simple. If we look at a normal cell, on the inside of the cell is the nuclei, and that contains DNA. And the DNA contains genes that control the actions of the cell. And one of those important actions is how a cell makes a copy of itself, how it goes through what we call the cell cycle. And so if you take a normal cell and put it in culture, it will simply make a copy of itself. And if there's room, those cells will make copies of themselves, and they'll keep doing that until they fill up that area. And if one of these cells dies, then an adjacent cell is going to jump into that cell cycle, and it's going to fill that hole. And so that's how you went from a zygote to the trillions of cells that are inside your body. And that's also how you replace cells. And so your skin is constantly losing cells off the surface, but we're creating cells underneath that. And so the cause of all cancers is the same. There's going to be damage to the DNA. And so that DNA is made up of what are called nucleotides. And there are tons of genes in there that are controlling this cell cycle, when a cell should make a copy of itself and when it should stop dividing. And so a mutation is simply damage to that DNA. Now, it could just occur spontaneously. If we all live long enough, we're all going to develop cancer because these mutations are going to start to accrue during our lifetime. But we can also increase the rate of those mutations using the environment. And so, for example, if we smoke cigarettes, that could cause mutations to the DNA. Increases in UV radiation, we're finding that decreases in exercise, increases in certain types of diet can cause mutations, and that can cause problems in the cell cycle. And so let's say we get a mutation in this cell right here. There are going to be genes within that cell that sense something is wrong, and lots of times it'll undergo apoptosis where that cell dies and another cell moves inside. But during our lifetime, we start to accrue more and more mutations, and eventually enough mutations build up in one of those cells, and it becomes not a normal cell, but a cancerous cell. And this takes a long time for that to occur. And so this is a pretty awful graph. This is the increase in the popularity of cigarettes. And so this is the number of cigarette smoking per person per year. And so as they were doing that, they were increasing the mutations inside their body. And we can look decades later, we see the causation. We can see an increase in lung cancer in men as well. And so as we make those mistakes in our cell, we form these cancerous cells. Now, what does a cancerous cell do? It doesn't matter that there's cells around it. It's simply going to divide and divide and divide over and over and over again. And eventually what you create is a tumor. Now, there are two types of tumor. If those cells are restricted to that one area and stay within a membrane, we call those benign tumors, and that's not cancer. But if there is no restriction to that area, it becomes what's called a malignant tumor, and that's really a definition of what cancer is. It's when we have these uncontrolled cell growth, and those cells that show uncontrolled cell growth spreading throughout our body. And so this is a video of some cancerous cells. And so instead of just growing and doing the jobs of the cell, you can see they're kind of misshapen, and all they do is make copies of themselves and copies of themselves over and over and over again. That's where all the energy is going. Now, if that was restricted to one area, it wouldn't be as big a deal, but they can move to different areas of the body. And so if we have a tumor right here, it can start to invade the tissues around it, and so that tumor can not only get larger, but can move into new areas. And if that tumor gets into the lymphatic system or the circulatory system, it can move around our body and it can settle somewhere else. And so that's the problem with a malignant tumor. And so we name cancers based on the tissues and the organs that they infect. So this would be lung cancer, but we could also have colon cancer or maybe a pancreatic cancer or breast cancer. It's basically named on the tissue of where it is. Now, each of those cancers, even though the cause is the same, damage to the DNA, which produces uncontrolled cell growth, the way they manifest the disease is going to be totally different. And so if you look at this x-ray, we can see this is somebody who has lung cancer, and there's going to be a tumor right there. And what we're finding is not only are all these different types of cancer different, but each of those individual tumors are different. And between two people, those tumors are going to be different. And even within the cells of the tumor, they're going to be different. And so what does that mean? Well, even though we might treat one tumor, we're going to find that within that tumor, there are going to be different cells. Each of those have different genetic problems. And so we could treat most of the tumor, remove most of it, but it's going to come back eventually over time. And so what do we have for treatments? And so since cancer is uncontrolled cell growth, we want to find those cells as quickly as we can. And so screening is the most important thing. Once we find that cancer has developed and we find that tumor, the first thing that we want to do is we want to remove that. And so surgery is generally what happens next. We remove that tumor. We also use radiation. In other words, we're not going to be able to remove all of those cells. They're going to be extraneous cells around it. And so we can target this with ionizing radiation and we can kill all those cells. Now this has dangers as well, and so we try to restrict that to that one area, but it can cause damage to the cells around it. And then oftentimes we'll use chemotherapy. Now what's chemotherapy doing? It's going throughout your whole body and it's targeting cells that are actively dividing, cells that are going through this cell cycle. And so that's why it affects, for example, you get a lot of nausea because it's affecting those cells in your digestive tract, or you lose your hair because it's affecting those cells that are constantly making new hair. And so with all of these, we're getting better and better at treating cancer. What's the future hold? Well, we're really just treating all cancers with these three methods the same. And so what we'll see is if we can get into the genetics and we start to understand how each of those cancers are different, then we can start to target them. And so one of the breakthroughs was Gleevec, which is one of these first drugs that's targeting a specific type of leukemia. And it was affecting a specific machinery within that cell. And so again, the more we understand about cancer, we find that they're all the same, but the causes are going to be different. And so what is cancer? It's simply uncontrolled cell growth, and I hope that was helpful.